Welcome back, everyone, to the deep dive. Today, we are going to be tackling something that I think is really fascinating. It's something that anyone who's ever tried to learn something really complex has probably struggled with. How do you actually get good at diagnosing things? Like when you are facing a problem and you have to figure out what's really going on, we are going to be looking at some research on diagnostic competence in medical and teacher education. And what's really interesting is that there are some pretty surprising similarities in how these really crucial skills are developed.
Yeah, that's right. When we talk about diagnostic competence, what we're really talking about is the ability to identify problems and then
Yeah.
to understand the context of those problems and then to apply your knowledge and experience to make good practical decisions.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense.
It applies to so many fields. Whether you are a doctor trying to figure out, what is causing a patient's symptoms, or you are a teacher trying to figure out why a student isn't understanding a concept. The core process of how you go about figuring that out actually has some really striking parallels.
Right. And it's those parallels that I think make this such a fascinating topic to dig into. You know, at first glance, you might think that diagnosing a physical ailment, like something in the body, is totally different from trying to figure out what's going on with the student's learning. But at a fundamental level, they both involve this kind of detective work
Absolutely.
where you are gathering specific clues and trying to put those clues together in a way that helps you to reduce the uncertainty.
Yeah, you're looking for patterns.
Right.
You're trying to figure out, is this thing connected to this thing? And then based on that, you can decide what to do next.
Exactly.
So one of the really key ways that research has shown that learners develop this ability is through something called scaffolding.
Yeah, scaffolding. We hear that term a lot in education, but I think it's helpful to sort of remind ourselves what it actually means.
Yeah, so scaffolding is really any kind of support that's given to a learner that helps them manage the complexity of the thing they're learning. So it's not doing it for them, it's not telling them the answer, it's giving them just enough support so that they can kind of reach that next level of understanding and then gradually become more and more independent. So, in a medical context, you could think about this as maybe a senior doctor who's guiding a resident through a diagnosis,
Mm,
giving them little hints, asking them questions, but not just giving away the answer right away.
right.
And in teaching, it could be something like a teacher who's providing a partially completed worksheet to a student who's struggling with a particular concept.
Hmm.
So just giving them enough support so they can get started and then kind of build from there.
Yeah, that's a great way to think about it. So, in order to really dig into what kinds of scaffolding or what kinds of support are actually most effective, the research that we're looking at today took the form of what's called a meta-analysis, which just means that researchers basically collected a whole bunch of studies on this topic, and then they combined the results of all those studies to try to get this sort of bigger, more reliable picture of what's going on.
And the meta-analysis that we're looking at specifically focused on studies that actually experimentally tested different types of instructional support
Right.
and compared that to, control conditions where that support wasn't there.
Right. So it's like a real apples to apples comparison.
Exactly. And they were really looking for, objective measures of learning.
Yeah.
So things like test scores
Yeah.
or how well someone actually performed on a diagnostic task.
So it's not just like their subjective opinion of, oh, I think I learned a lot. It's like, can they actually demonstrate that they've learned something?
All right.
All right, so let's get into the nitty gritty here. What did this meta-analysis actually reveal about how effective instructional support is at building diagnostic skills in these two fields of medicine and teaching?
Yeah. So the main finding, and this is pretty encouraging, is that instructional support actually has a medium positive effect on helping people develop diagnostic competences in both medicine and teaching.
That's great to hear.
Yeah, and the researchers, calculated this using a statistical measure called Hedges G, and they found that it was 0.39.
Okay.
And importantly, that result was statistically significant,
Right.
which basically just means that we can be pretty confident that this positive effect isn't just due to random chance.
Right. It's a real thing. So that's good to hear that there's this overall positive effect. But I have a feeling that as anyone who's learned something really complex knows, it's probably not quite that simple.
Yeah, you are absolutely right. So the researchers actually found that there was a lot of what they call heterogeneity between all those different studies that they were looking at.
Heterogeneity.
Heterogeneity, yeah, which basically just means variation.
Yeah.
So while the overall trend was positive, the fact that there was so much difference from one study to the next tells us that there are all these other really important factors that play a role that can influence, how well instructional support actually works.
Right. It's sort of like saying that rain generally makes things wet, but how wet they get depends on a whole lot of other things.
Exactly.
Like how hard is it raining? For how long is it raining? What is the surface that the rain is falling on? All sorts of things like that.
Absolutely.
So in the case of diagnostic competence, it sounds like we need to look at those other factors to really understand why sometimes instructional support works really well, and maybe sometimes it doesn't work quite as well. So what's one of those key factors that kind of came out of this research?
Well, one really crucial piece of the puzzle
Mm.
is the learner's prior professional knowledge.
Oh, that makes sense.
Yeah.
Okay.
So how much do they already know coming into the learning experience? And what the researchers found is that this actually significantly affects how beneficial different types of instructional support can be. And what was really interesting is that they found that learners who started out with a lower level of prior professional knowledge actually showed a bigger increase in their diagnostic competences compared to those who already had more knowledge.
Oh, that's interesting. So you might think that someone who already knows more would benefit even more from extra support. But it sounds like maybe they hit a ceiling a little bit faster or something.
Yeah, that's a great point. It could be that, if you already have a lot of knowledge, maybe the support isn't quite as tailored to your specific needs anymore. Or maybe it even starts to get in the way a little bit of your own process that you've already developed.
Yeah, that makes sense. So I guess it's really important then to think about tailoring that support to the level of the learner.
Yeah,
Yeah.
absolutely.
So I'm curious, in this meta-analysis, how did the researchers define like what they meant by low versus high prior knowledge? Like what did they actually look at to make that distinction?
Yeah, that's a great question. So in general, what they considered low prior knowledge was basically anyone who had, little to no experience in the specific context that they were learning about, or who was just in the really early stages of their professional training.
Right. So like a brand new medical student who's encountering a certain disease for the first time, or a student teacher who's just, beginning their observations in a classroom.
Right, exactly. Those are great examples. And then on the other hand, high prior knowledge would mean that those learners had more experience. They had encountered similar
Yeah.
situations before, or
Hmm.
they were further along in their training, so they already had a more solid foundation of knowledge.
Right. That makes a lot of sense. It's not just how smart you are, it's really about your experience with that specific thing you are trying to learn. Okay, cool. So it sounds like there's this really interesting interplay between your prior knowledge and then the type of support that you get. Now, the outline also mentions these concepts of problem solving and scaffolding. So I'm wondering how those fit into this whole picture of developing diagnostic competence.
Yeah. Well, problem solving actually emerged as a really, really important factor in this meta-analysis.
Okay.
They found very clearly that when instruction actually included opportunities for learners to actively engage in problem solving, it was way more effective at developing those diagnostic competences than instruction that didn't. So basically, they found that the effect size was much higher, like a 0.51 when problem solving was included versus only 0.20 when it wasn't.
Wow, so that's a really big
Yeah,
difference.
and the difference was statistically significant, which again just means that, we can be pretty confident that this wasn't just due to chance.
Right. So this really kind of underscores that it's not enough to just read about case studies or to, listen to someone lecture about diagnostic processes. You have to actually get your hands dirty, so to speak, and actively work through those problems, whether they're simulated or in the real world, to really get good at it.
Yeah, it's like anything else, the more you actually practice, the better you get.
Right.
And you have to practice the actual skill, not just learn about it.
Absolutely. So that kind of leads us into the concept of scaffolding, which we've touched on a bit already. I'm wondering what this study specifically revealed about the effectiveness of different types of scaffolding. Like, what are the specific things that instructors or teachers can do to really help people develop these skills?
Yeah, so the researchers actually looked at several different common scaffolding techniques, things like using examples, assigning roles, providing prompts, and incorporating reflection phases into the learning process. So let's start with examples, because that seems pretty intuitive.
Yeah, you would think that seeing examples of, how an expert diagnoses something would always be helpful.
You would think so, right? But actually, the overall effect of including examples versus not including them wasn't actually statistically significant across all the learners that they looked at.
Oh, that's interesting. So just showing people examples isn't some magic bullet that's going to improve their skills.
Not necessarily. But when they actually looked at how the effective examples interacted with that prior knowledge level that we were talking about before, a more interesting picture started to emerge.
Okay.
So they found that for learners with low prior knowledge, seeing examples was actually really helpful. It did have a positive effect. But for learners with high prior knowledge, the examples didn't really seem to provide much of an extra benefit.
Huh. So that kind of supports what we were talking about before with people who already have a lot of experience. Maybe they're not getting as much out of those basic examples.
Right, and this actually starts to hint at something that's called the expertise reversal effect, which the source we're looking at mentions a little bit later on.
Expertise reversal effect. Okay.
And the idea here is that if you give too much really explicit guidance, like very simple examples to people who already have a good understanding of the field, it can actually backfire.
Oh, so it can actually hinder their learning?
Yeah, because it can kind of interfere with their own internal problem-solving processes that they've already developed.
That's fascinating. So it's like you are giving them training wheels when they've already learned to ride a bike.
Exactly, and they're like, get these training wheels out of here. I don't need these anymore.
Yeah, I'm going to fall over with these training wheels on.
Yeah.
Right. So examples maybe not always the best approach, especially for more advanced learners. So what about some of those other scaffolding techniques? You mentioned assigning roles. What does that look like in practice?
Yeah, so assigning learners an active role during the learning process actually had a really big impact on their diagnostic competence. So this could be something like, having them act as the physician or the teacher in a
No,
simulation.
well, like role playing, essentially.
Yeah,
Yeah.
exactly. Yeah, role-playing, giving them a specific role to play. And the study actually coded that as agent.
Okay.
But when roles weren't explicitly assigned, they didn't see any kind of significant positive effect. So it really highlights, the value of active participation.
Yeah.
It's not enough to just be a passive observer. You have to actually step into that role and try to apply the knowledge.
Right. So it's that old adage of tell me and I forget, teach me and I may remember, involve me and I learn.
Exactly.
Awesome. Okay, what about prompts? I feel like I've heard that term a lot in education. What are prompts and how do they work?
Yeah, so prompts are basically, little nudges or hints or questions that you can give to learners to kind of guide their thinking. So it's not giving them the answer, but it's kind of pointing them in the right direction.
Right.
And the study found that using prompts had a really significant positive effect on developing those diagnostic skills. But what was really interesting is that they also looked at when those prompts were given. And they found that prompts that were given after the learner had already made their diagnosis were actually more helpful than prompts that were given during the process itself.
Oh, that's interesting. So it's not about kind of holding their hand through the process, but it's more about giving them feedback and helping them reflect after they've already made an attempt.
Exactly.
That's really cool.
Yeah. And they also found that prompts that encouraged kind of longer-term reflection and deeper thinking about the process were also really effective.
Okay.
So this kind of suggests that the real value of prompts is not so much about getting the answer right in the moment, but it's more about encouraging learners to really think critically about their decisions after the fact and to kind of figure out, why did I make that decision? What could I have done differently?
Right. So it's really about developing that metacognitive awareness.
Absolutely.
Like understanding your own thinking processes. That's really powerful. So I guess it's a reminder to educators and to learners that sometimes it's more helpful to step back and reflect rather than to just try to get the answer right immediately.
Yeah, and it's a reminder that making mistakes is actually a really important part of the learning process.
Totally. Okay, so we've talked about examples, roles, and prompts.
Mhm.
What about reflection phases? What are those and how do they fit into all of this?
Yeah, so reflection phases are basically just times that are built into the learning process where learners are specifically asked to think about their goals, their learning goals, and to analyze how they've been doing and to kind of plan for their future learning.
Okay.
And the study found that incorporating these reflection phases also had a really significant positive effect on developing diagnostic competence.
Okay.
And interestingly, they found that more advanced learners actually seemed to benefit the most from those reflection phases.
Oh, that's interesting. So again, maybe it's because they have more to reflect on.
Yeah, right. They have that deeper knowledge base to draw on, so they can really engage in those kind of higher level thinking processes.
Right, that makes sense. So to kind of recap our discussion on scaffolding, it sounds like the big takeaways here are that actively taking on a role, like in a simulation, using thoughtful prompts, but giving those prompts after a diagnosis has been made, and then incorporating time for structured reflection, all of those seem to be really valuable tools for helping people develop these skills.
Exactly. And then keeping in mind that examples can be helpful for beginners, but maybe less so for those more advanced learners.
Right, so really tailoring those scaffolding approaches to the individual. That makes a lot of sense. Now, I'm curious, the researchers also looked at how the context of the diagnostic situation itself might play a role. So can you talk a little bit about that?
Yeah, absolutely. So they were really interested in whether, the actual situation that you're in when you're trying to make a diagnosis can influence how well you do.
Yeah.
So, for example, are you working with a real patient or a real student, or are you just reading about a case study in a textbook?
Right, like how realistic is that diagnostic situation?
Exactly. And they specifically focused on two main aspects of that context. One was what they called the information base.
Okay.
So where are you actually getting your information from? And the other was what they call the processing mode, which basically just means, are you working on this diagnosis by yourself or are you collaborating with other people?
Right, so individual versus group work. Okay, cool. So let's start with the information base. What did they find there?
Well, they found that when diagnosis was what they called interaction-based, meaning that you're actually gathering information through some kind of real or simulated interaction with a person. It led to much stronger diagnostic competence than when it was just document-based.
Okay, so document-based, meaning you're just reading a chart or a file or something like that.
Exactly. So, it's one thing to read about a patient's symptoms in a chart, but it's a whole other thing to actually talk to the patient and ask them questions and really understand, what they're experiencing.
Right. And I imagine the same thing is true in teaching, right? It's one thing to look at a student's test score, but it's a totally different thing to actually have a conversation with that student about how they approached a problem.
Absolutely.
You can get so much more nuance and so much more information through that interaction.
Yeah, and it allows you to kind of ask those follow-up questions that you might not even think of if you're just looking at a static document.
Right. And maybe to even observe things like body language or tone of voice that could give you clues.
Exactly. So it really highlights the value of that active engagement and gathering information firsthand whenever possible.
Cool. Okay, what about collaboration? What did they find about the role of working with others on a diagnosis?
So overall collaboration actually didn't reach what we call statistical significance,
Yeah.
meaning that it wasn't a consistent finding across all the studies.
Okay.
But there was an interesting trend that emerged, which was that learners in teacher education actually seemed to benefit more from collaboration than those in medical education.
Oh, that's interesting.
Yeah, and the researchers kind of speculated that this might have to do with the way that collaboration is typically structured and valued in those different fields.
Right. So maybe in teacher education, there's more of a culture of collaboration and teamwork already built in, whereas in medicine, it's maybe more of a hierarchical model.
Exactly. And they also suggested that it could have something to do with the nature of the tasks themselves.
Okay.
Maybe the kinds of diagnostic problems that teachers face lend themselves more naturally to collaborative problem solving.
Interesting. So again, it kind of comes back to that idea of context matters.
Absolutely.
You can't just assume that one approach is going to work equally well in all situations. Now, I know that the researchers also talked about some of the theoretical implications of their findings and also some of the limitations of doing a meta-analysis like this. So can you tell us a little bit about those?
Yeah, so from a theoretical standpoint, this research really just kind of strengthens that idea that actively practicing problem solving is super crucial for developing expertise in diagnosis.
Okay.
And that holds true, in both medicine and teaching, which is really interesting.
Right.
It also reinforces the idea that scaffolding can be really helpful for learning, but it provides some really interesting nuances to how we think about that expertise reversal effect.
Right, right. So that idea that too much scaffolding can actually be detrimental for more advanced learners.
Exactly. And what they found is that it's not necessarily that all scaffolding is bad for advanced learners. It's that it really depends on how that scaffolding is implemented.
Okay.
So if the scaffolding is getting in the way of the learner's own well-developed problem-solving strategies, then it can backfire.
Right. It's like giving them instructions that are too basic or too simple, and it just kind of slows them down.
Exactly. But if the scaffolding is supporting their existing processes and helping them to kind of refine those processes, then it can be really valuable.
Right. So it's about finding that sweet spot where the scaffolding is challenging enough, but not so challenging that it's overwhelming.
Absolutely. And the researchers actually link this to the idea of the Sesame Street effect or the Matthew effect,
Hmm.
which is this idea that, people who start out with more advantages tend to gain more from educational interventions.
Well, that's interesting.
So it's not about dumbing things down for the experts. It's about finding ways to help them continue to build on that strong foundation that they already have.
Right, so it's kind of like a rising tide lifts all boats situation.
Exactly.
Okay, that's really fascinating. So what about some of the limitations of this meta-analysis? I know that whenever we're looking at research, it's always important to kind of think critically about what those limitations might be.
Absolutely. So the researchers themselves pointed out a few limitations of their work. One was that even though they were looking at both medical and teacher education, they didn't always have enough data in specific subcategories to make really detailed comparisons between the two fields on every single aspect of instruction.
Right.
So, maybe there are some more subtle differences that they just weren't able to detect with the data that they had.
Okay.
Another limitation is that the way that different types of scaffolding were categorized in the original studies that they were looking at was sometimes pretty broad.
Right.
So, for example, y- the category of prompts could include a huge range of different kinds of hints and guidance.
Right. Right.
And it would have been helpful to be able to kind of break that down and look at the effects of more specific types of prompts.
Okay.
Another challenge is that in a lot of the studies they were looking at, they use multiple different types of instructional support at the same time.
Right.
So it can be really hard to kind of tease apart the effects of each one.
Right. Right. So it's hard to say for sure, was it the prompts that made the difference, or was it the role playing, or was it some combination of factors?
Exactly. And then finally, they pointed out that most of the studies they were looking at focused on kind of general diagnostic competence.
Okay.
And they didn't really look at how different types of instructional support might affect different types of professional knowledge.
Right.
So, there's a difference between having a really deep conceptual understanding of something and actually being able to apply that knowledge in a practical setting.
Totally.
And it would have been interesting to see if different instructional approaches maybe have different effects on those different types of knowledge.
Yeah, that's a really great point. So I guess the takeaway here is that this meta-analysis gives us a really valuable kind of overview of the field, but it also highlights some areas where we still need more research to kind of get a more nuanced understanding.
Absolutely. And the researchers actually did some additional statistical analysis to kind of look at the strength of their findings. And based on those analyses, they suggested that for certain specific aspects of their results, the evidence might be a little bit less robust. And so, we should interpret those findings with some caution.
Right, so it's not that those findings are wrong, it's just that we need to be a little bit more tentative about them until we have more research to kind of confirm them.
Exactly.
Okay, awesome. So as we start to wrap up this deep dive into the development of diagnostic competence, can you kind of just give us a quick summary of the key takeaways here?
Yeah, absolutely. So it seems pretty clear that providing instructional support is generally a good thing for helping people to develop their diagnostic skills in both medicine and teaching.
Okay.
But the kind of support that you provide and how you deliver that support really matters.
Right. It's not just a one-size-fits-all approach.
Exactly. And we've seen that things like the learner's existing knowledge level, whether they're actively engaged in problem solving, the specific types of scaffolding that are used, and even the context of the diagnostic situation, all those things can influence how effective that support is going to be.
Right. So it really is about being thoughtful and intentional about how we design those learning experiences. And I think it's really cool to see that there are these underlying similarities in the learning process for these two professions that on the surface seem very different.
Yeah, it's really remarkable when you think about it. It suggests that the way we learn to diagnose a medical condition and the way we learn to diagnose a student's learning challenge might share some really fundamental cognitive principles.
Right. So maybe there are some universal principles of diagnostic reasoning that we can apply across different fields.
Absolutely. And that brings us to our final thought for you, the listener.
Yes. So as you go about your own learning journey, whether it's in your professional life or in your personal life, we want you to think about how these findings might apply to you.
Yeah, are you getting enough opportunities to actively diagnose situations and to reflect on your decisions?
Yeah.
And is the support that you're getting really tailored to your current level of expertise?
Those are some really great questions to ponder. And as the research that we've been discussing today highlights our understanding of how these complex skills develop is still evolving, so there's a lot more work to be done.
Absolutely. And one area that we really need more research on is the specific impact of different scaffolding techniques on the different aspects of diagnostic competence. And it would also be really valuable to look more closely at the role of motivation in all of this.
Right, because even if you have the best scaffolding in the world, if you are not motivated to learn, you are not going to get very far.
Exactly. So if any of these topics have piqued your interest, we encourage you to check out the research that we've been talking about today and to really dive into this fascinating field.
Yeah, and who knows, maybe you'll be the one to conduct that next groundbreaking study on diagnostic competence.
Yeah.
Well, that's all the time we have for today. Thanks for joining us for another deep dive. We'll be back soon with more explorations into the world of learning and expertise.